Here we'll take various different styles of EQ and use them to tonally shape our mix to bring balance and color to the entirety of our mix. We'll take a look at 2 different EQ plugins, each with their own kind of characteristic and style, and then that'll kind of give you a good basis to work off of whenever you're working on your mixes. So the first EQ that we'll take a look at is going to be the FabFilter Pro Q2. You could use any of the versions of FabFilter Pro Q you'd like. I just currently have the second version, so that's one that we'll be using. And then we'll be taking a look at the UAD Hitsville EQ, which is a vintage emulated master bus EQ that's used to add all sorts of color to a mix. So it's a little bit different than the Pro Q. It's not designed for surgical EQing. It's designed more for tonal shaping, which makes it really great on a mix bus. So 2 different styles, kind of 2 different things you could do with EQ, and we'll take a look at each of those and kind of break them down. You can also use stock plugins here as well. But again, if we're shaping the entirety of our mix bus, I'd recommend using the best available gear that you have because it will sound a lot better in the long run. But the best effects are always the ones that you currently have. So don't let not having expensive EQ plugins hold you back. Just use whatever you have that's the best possible option. Okay, so let's use the FabFilter Pro Q. And we'll go ahead and load that up onto my mix bus here. And again, you could use any of the versions of Pro Q that you would like. We've also switched gears musically as well. Now we're in kind of like an indie folk acoustic track. This is from my Mixing with UAD Spark course that I did on Groove 3 as well. I'll include a master bounce of this, so you can have a 2-track version of this. You could just play around with some mix processing if you'd like. And feel free to check out that whole course as well if you'd also like to see how I did this entire mix from the unprocessed stems all the way through to a mix. So this is what the record sounds like. So definitely switching gears from that dance record that we used previously, but I wanted to show you that mix bus processing can be used on any style of music, not just electronic styles. So let's start simple and use the Pro Q and start messing around with some of these different settings. So the first thing to note is if you find yourself using really surgical EQ curves, so let's say we wanted to grab like an individual frequency and pulling that out, and you see things like this on your mix bus EQ, just go back into the individual tracks and fix it. Don't do this on your mix bus. You'll get a much cleaner result. Because we are still mixing the record, we don't have just a 2-track bounce for mastering. We are still mixing it. We can go back and change the level of an acoustic guitar or add more reverb to a piano or whatever we would like. And that'll just give me a much more clean sounding mix in the long run. So don't use any surgical EQing here. This is generally for kind of tonal shaping. And usually whenever I'm mixing records as well, I don't mix into EQ very much. I kind of find myself doing this at the end of a mix or when I'm almost like maybe 80 to 70% done with my mix. I'll start kind of going through and pushing and pulling things in the mix bus and seeing where that can take my production. Okay, so the best way to approach this whenever we're adding mix bus EQ is kind of have a goal for where we want to take things. Is there a need for brightness across the whole mix? Do we need some mid-range presence or clarity or more sub-bass or less sub-bass? We kind of want to have an identifying goal here so that we can make the right decision for our mix instead of just moving around randomly with this EQ. So let's go ahead and listen to the track back and see how we can kind of enhance that overall mix. So I think there's a little bit more mid-range presence, especially around kind of the lower end of that vocal register. So not the top end of the vocal, but kind of that mid-rangey stuff that could be pushed a little bit more just to bring it kind of out of the speakers a little bit. And then also sort of the sub bass on the record feels a little bit muted. So I can sort of push that just a little bit to enhance the overall picture of my mix. Let's go ahead and grab those mids first. And we'll do this with really wide Q bands because we're basically just trying to generally tonal shape everything. We're not trying to go through and individually just grab little frequencies. So let's find kind of the low end section of the vocal. So it's not that boxy stuff, it's like right above it. So 1.7 is basically where that is. And then obviously we don't want 2 dB, we just want a little bit of this. And you'll notice here I'm adding just a touch of EQ. We're not going through and adding 2 or 3 dBs. It's literally like half a dB, or 0.62 in this case, so slightly over. But it's just a little bit, but it actually makes a huge difference in terms of clarity on the mix. So we're getting that vocal and that whole mid-range section to really pop out. We could maybe even just dial that back too. It could be super general, very subtle. And it just pushes that mix together just a little bit more. Let's also go ahead and grab the sub bass. So I'm gonna go ahead and solo that. It's kind of that low end section, that kick, like 65. Sounds really nice. Let's go ahead and make that a little bit wider and dial that down. So it really just glues that mix together and makes it so I can hear everything a lot more clear. So that main vocal and some of those guitars and stuff that are sort of generally in this frequency range are being pushed out a little bit. That sub bass is just coming forward just a little bit more, even though it's literally below half a dB. It's just 0.30. So it's just a little bit. That enables us to just have a much more clear mix. And in terms of the overall vibe and color of everything, it just gives us a lot more space within our mix. So that is the first way that we can use EQ, is kind of more in this general tonal shaping way with a parametric EQ. The other thing that I would recommend trying out with EQ is to use EQs that are specifically designed for coloring mix buses. So vintage emulations, tube EQs, and ones that have preset frequency ranges. You can kind of use those more in a general way, so you can sort of see where your mix can go rather than having a specific goal like what we did with the FabFilter Pro Q. So let's go ahead and delete that. And then let's go ahead and grab the UAD Hitsville Mastering EQ. So we'll grab this one right here, drag and drop that on. And again, this is also all UAD Spark plugins as well, which are the native versions of the UAD stuff. You could also use the DSP accelerated versions too, or any EQ you like, it doesn't matter. This is just the one that we'll be taking a look at. And then something like this EQ is designed to really just add flavor. It's not an ultra detailed parametric EQ or anything like that. It's designed for mixing and designed for mastering. And it's also emulating a hardware signal path. So it's different than the FabFilter Pro Q, which won't impart any color onto your sound just by running it through. With something like this, it actually does start to add in a little bit of color, saturation, harmonics. And that just kind of helps give your mix a little bit more of that vintage vibe. The other fun part about this EQ is because it has preset frequency ranges, you can literally just get really creative with it and just sort of boost at random or cut at random and just see where it can take your mix. So this is used in a much more sort of tonal shaping, coloring way than something more specific like a parametric EQ. And again, feel free to go back and adjust different levels inside your mix too. If you're finding that once you start boosting things, something pops out in the mix, you can go through and change that on an individual track basis. So let's go ahead and just play our record and start playing around with some of these boosts and see where we can go. So the first thing I want to do, I want to boost some bass, because as we saw earlier, whenever we were messing around with the FabFilter Pro Q, it kind of lacked a little bit of that sub bass on the record. So let's see what we could do whenever we're boosting at 25. So obviously when we put that at like 7 dB, it's too much. But just a little bit, just kind of boosts that bass and makes it pop out of the speakers a little more. It is also worth noting there is a little bit of a volume boost in this plugin, so I would take that down just a little bit, just so you actually can hear what it's doing. So it kind of just brings a bit more balance to the main bass. Let's play around with this, see what we can do. So that stuff just kind of sounds muddy. Kind of just ends up affecting the clarity of the record, so we'll just leave that at 0. Let's try this other one. So at 160, it starts to kind of pull out some mids. I think with that one, you end up kind of losing some of the vocal information because we kind of have a little bit lower of a male vocal. So listen to this. So we start to kind of lose a little bit of that presence because these are really broad frequency curves. They're not ultra fine. So I don't want to pull that out. We'll just leave that as is. Let's hop over to 400, see what this could do for us. So this is actually adding some nice body. Obviously 5 decibels is way too much. Just pushes that vocal out of the speakers and also some of those mid-range electric guitars and stuff. So before and after, it's actually quite drastic. Let's hop over to the next one. About a 1000, that's also another one of those ranges where a lot of vocals and stuff tend to hang out, so I think a little bit of that may sound nice. I like that at 1 dB. Let's try 2500. So whenever you boost that all the way up, it's actually surprising how soft that sounds, even though we're doing 8 decibel gain increase here. But you kind of get some sizzle on that snare. Listen back to that snare. You also do get some weird vocal harmonics as well, but mainly the thing that's jumping out to me here that I do like is kind of how that snare just ends up sort of popping out of the mix a bit more. So let's go ahead and take this, and again, just add a little bit here. We're not trying to go wild. This is a mix bus, and we just want to kind of generally tonal shape. Just kind of livens up that snare. And then let's go ahead and boost the top. So this should actually sound quite nice when we add a little bit too much of it. That just adds that sizzle and top end air to everything because it's a vintage emulation of like some analog equipment. It's actually rather soft sounding. And obviously we don't want that much, so let's go ahead and play around. So I think I like that at about 2. So as you notice with this EQ, because it's styled in a different way than like a parametric EQ, the process of adding this to the mix bus is a little bit more freeform and creative, because I can kind of just see where it can take my mix rather than having like a specific goal. And that's what's kind of fun about these styles of EQ whenever you're putting them on mix buses, is you just have a lot of options just to kind of see where it can take you. Let's listen to before and after and see how we've enhanced our mix. It's also gain matched as well. I'll take that down 2. So we have a lot more brightness, a lot more clarity, and that mix kind of comes together a lot better. So it kind of goes from being a little bit dark and a little bit muddy. And then when we add it in, it's a pretty subtle processing because most of this is like 1 to 2 dB. The only one that's actually doing 2 decibels is over here on the top end. So most of it is actually quite subtle, but it just adds this nice life to the record. You could even maybe dial back that top end. So that's kind of a way that we can use EQ to add a lot more balance to our recording using a single EQ plugin on the mix bus. So this is really a process of experimenting and seeing what you can come up with. So depending on the style of EQ you're using, you can impart color and saturation onto your track as well. And you just have a lot of different creative options whenever you're adding EQ to your mix buses. So try this out whenever you're working on your next mix and see how it can elevate and enhance the sound of your recordings.